Now, tomorrow, Governor Josh Shapiro will give his annual budget address outlining the spending he wants to see in Pennsylvania this coming year.
Last year's budget was approved by the General Assembly 6 months late, passing in December finally. And with a recent Pennsylvania Supreme Court decision demanding lawmakers change how Pennsylvania funds its schools, time is of the essence in Harrisburg.
As Fox 43's Marshall Keeley explains tonight, before the governor even announces a dollar amount, a bigger problem lies ahead for state lawmakers.
Last summer, Pennsylvania schools took the state to court and won. The state Supreme Court found that the Pennsylvania General Assembly created funding deficiencies for decades, leaving gaps between high-wealth and low-wealth school districts. It ruled the current system is unconstitutional and that lawmakers have to fix it. Pennsylvania schools are funded in 3 different ways. 11% comes from the federal government, 36% comes from the state, and the rest, a whopping 53%, comes from localities, mainly local property taxes. Now, for the moment, what we're going to focus on is this 36% that comes from the state, because depending on your zip code, the number your district receives can be very different. The state uses 2 methods to decide how much state funding a school receives. The first is called hold harmless, and it's based on the principle that districts should never get less than they did last year. Nathan Benefield is Senior Vice President of the Commonwealth Foundation.
Some of these school districts have lost 50 to 60% of their students, but are still getting the same amount of money, and that's propping up buildings, it's propping up staff, and focusing on adults and not kids.
Where else in your life would you keep spending money on something, despite the fact that you're having declining customers or clients?
This is how schools have predominantly been funded since the mid-2000s.
Wake you up at night.
But in 2015, in order to adjust for poverty, changing student populations, and other needs of districts, a bipartisan group of lawmakers called the Basic Education Funding Commission, or BEFC, created a way to address those problems. Republican State Senator Kristen Phillips Hill is co-chair of the commission.
And the law says that every 5 years, the Basic Education Funding Commission has to be reconstituted to evaluate if the funding formula being used to drive out basic education funding dollars is doing a good job.
This was the solution. It's the BEFC's fair funding formula. Now, I know it looks incredibly complicated, but basically it determines how much each school district receives based on how many kids are in a district, how many are in poverty, or how many are learning English as a second language. But not all state education money runs through this formula. Lawmakers decided only new education dollars that come into the budget would go through this formula. So right now, just 25% of state education funding is handed out using the fair funding formula, something that Shapiro could propose to change in his budget address. Democratic State Representative Mike Sturla is the other BEFC co-chair. Is the goal ultimately to get to the point where 100% of the school funding is going through the fair funding formula?
Yeah. What we've done is said, okay, we're not going to touch hold harmless. Right now, 350 school districts benefit from hold harmless, and 150 school districts are hurt. If you put the dollars into the base, like we're proposing, you end up with about 50 school districts that are benefiting from hold harmless, and they're not benefiting by much. And so at that point in time, the point sort of becomes moot.
Republican State Senator Greg Rothman is also part of the commission.
When I first got to the House, we voted on the current formula, and we only applied it to new money. Why not apply it to all the money? If it's a fair funding formula, which I believe this is.
There were a lot of people who said, we need to push all dollars through that new formula, the formula adopted in 2015. When you crunched the numbers and you looked at that, there were about 300 plus school districts that would have been bankrupted by that.
The Pennsylvania School Board Association says the formula can make it hard for districts to set their budgets.
And we do think it is doing a good job. But one thing that happens as more dollars get put into the formula is we see greater volatility. So one year a district might be up $1 million, and then the next year they could be down $1 million. That sort of lack of predictability is very difficult for our members as they try to project forward and look into future years.
After the state Supreme Court ruling, the Basic Education Funding Commission spent the year traveling the state to make recommendations to help address the issue. Last month, the BEFC outlined 2 different sets of recommendations voted along party lines.
We looked at successful schools around the state of Pennsylvania and said, what do they spend on students? And then said, if we spent that amount on students and demanded the schools actually use proven data and proven programs that get results, then we should be able to get a good result back out of that. And what we came up with was a number of $5.2 to $5.4 billion necessary to go into the fund.
Aaron Chapin is president of the Pennsylvania State Education Association.
When we saw what the majority report was, we were so pleased with what they were suggesting, because it's something that we've been talking about for decades that our students and our schools need. And they've laid out a plan. It's a 7-year plan, because obviously more than $5 billion of new money is a lot to invest. A lot's going to be done, but we can't fix this overnight. This problem has been caused over decades of neglect.
It's not our responsibility to come up with a dollar amount. That's the responsibility of the legislature. And I don't think it would be prudent. I mean, can't imagine what would happen if you added another $7 billion to where we're going to get that money from.
I still listen to colleagues who talk about having public schools in their districts that have 0% proficiency in math and 0% proficiency in reading. So clearly throwing more money isn't the only solution.
Our concern is much more, how is that money being distributed? Because we've had massive increases in funding, but a lot of it isn't being distributed in an equitable way.
We still got to negotiate all this, and this is where the sort of rubber hits the road.
So what remains to be seen is how much Governor Shapiro is going to allocate to education this year. Tomorrow night, we'll look at the details of that budget and see if it matches the recommendations made by lawmakers. We have both BEFC reports, including the breakdown of how much each school district would stand to gain, on our website, fox43.com. Marshall Keeley, Fox 43 News.